Hello everybody, Dokkan Assets here. Today we are back with another animation analysis video, and in honor of the big boys Fizz Broly and AGL Gogeta finally getting their EZA, I figured it was about time we did a animation analysis video on the both of these dudes. I've actually never done one on either of them. I was kind of thinking for some reason that I had, but I haven't, and so now's as good a time as any with obviously these guys getting an EZA. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at BROLY, and then in the next video that'll probably be posted like an hour after this one, we will be taking a look at Gogeta. Now, couple of things to note before we get started with this video. For one, with all my animation analysis videos, I always like to say I am not a professional by any stretch of the imagination. I just play a lot of Dokkan. I look at the assets so I know what makes up these different super attacks. I look at super attacks all the time, so I'd like to think that I have a pretty good understanding of what makes a good super attack, right? So do keep that in mind. I am not a professional animator. However, our next point is something that you definitely are going to be wanting to take into consideration. I don't know why I said however, because that really doesn't make grammatical sense, but it doesn't matter. So, these guys are obviously pretty old, right? These guys came out quite some time ago. In fact, if we pop over to the Dokkan Wiki, you can see that on the JP version of the game, these guys actually came out in 2018. Wow, it was that long ago. Holy cow. Basically like 4 years until they got their EZA, because obviously this is like kind of close in time, right? Literally a day after Christmas Day, as you can see for Broly. So that is something that I want you to keep in mind while we're taking a look at these. Obviously, when you're doing, in-depth sort of analysis on these Dokkan animations, you really have to keep in mind what was the best quality animations at the time, what was the quality, what was the gold standard, because obviously we're not going to be judging these with the same outlook as we do a brand new Dokkan Fest LR, right? And you guys know that when it comes to these type of units, I always like to use this guy as my sort of gold standard. In my opinion, this guy was basically the first unit that had animations that were really good, kind of blew everybody out of the water. He was the first unit that everybody was like, okay, Dokkan's taking this animation game seriously. And as you can see, he came out on Halloween, actually, on October 31st of the same year that Broly came out. So we can expect the same type of quality from the animations from Broly and from Gogeta as we can with Metal Cooler. The other cool thing that we do have for you today is, because these guys are so old, the boy Giad, who obviously does the super fantastic Dokkan versus anime comparisons, which of course I'll leave a link to in the description below, we have comparisons for Broly and for Gogeta with their entire animation. So of course we're going to take a look at these as we go through the video here today, but as per usual, let's go ahead and watch through this at 1x speed, and then we will take a look at these in our slowdown mode. Now unfortunately they're not going to be as high quality as some of the later animations. The Dokkan Twitter team really stepped up their game on the quality that they post the essays in over time, and since these were just taken from the Twitter account, obviously they're not going to be as high quality. I really like that Super Saiyan Super, by the way. It's super simple, but it works extremely well for what Broly does. And even though this transformation is basically just transferring between one PNG to another, I really like all the references to the Broly movie that they pack in there. This super has always been really cool for me too. I love the way that they did the mouth beams. I was always so impressed with the close-ups for this, because I feel like they just go so extra. Like, they don't need to add all of this stuff. Like, I feel like even just the beginning back then, I was like, okay, Broly, I see you. And then the end section is just like, you go crazy, because it's absolutely insane that, they were able to, not only pack all that in there, but make it look really good for the time that it came out, to be honest with you. One thing I will say though is that I do have to note that these animations aren't really super faithful to the Broly movie style completely. I think they do a pretty good job for the time, but obviously comparing this guy to something like STR Gogeta, which of course that unit came out during a time where animations were way farther quality than we have now, so I think they did a good job for the time, but obviously it's not like that insane, like, basically picture perfect, you know, type of comparison. So let's actually take a look at this guy next to his original animation, because I think there's a lot of cool details that I would like to show you with what we're packing in here. So obviously the introduction to Broly's super attack here is when he is coming up out of the ground, right? This scene is super cool, and I remember when I saw these animations for the first time, I was really happy that they included this, because I think this is one of the coolest scenes from the movie, and obviously this is one of the big scenes from the trailers as well, so of course it's super recognizable. Those Broly trailers will never get out of my head, man. Especially Paragus saying, do it, Broly! You know, and then in the movie he says, Broly, do it! And it was so lame compared to the trailer. But the movie was fantastic, obviously. So yeah, of course, we have Broly shooting up from the ground, which I think in the Dokkan version looks extremely well done, if I do say so myself. Like, I was super impressed when I saw this for the first time. Like, I think they do a great job with the effects, you know, sort of emulating that look from the Broly movie. I think it's a very faithful recreation. Obviously, again, not exact like it maybe would be if they made this guy in the modern day, but still absolutely fantastic nonetheless. By the way, with Jihad's comparisons, he didn't have a still image here when the card art was on the screen. Back when he was making these videos, it was just kind of like the animation continued, basically. So do keep that in mind when the card art is on the screen. And this is such a weird close-up, I always felt like, but I did not realize that this was even movie accurate as well, right? With how close Broly's face is to the camera here, I did not realize that that was how it was in the original movie, to be honest with you, right? And of course, it's not completely like the original. As you can see, there's the motion lines, but I do really like what Dokkan does with this, you know, sort of close-up shot. They do, I guess, emulate it here pretty well, but it is on the screen for a lot quicker than it is, obviously, in this version. But even for the time, right? And again, this is where you're going to kind of see some of the dated type of stuff, right? A lot of fading between assets was still very much used during this time. I mean, they still do it for some essays now, but with this guy, obviously you're going to see it quite a bit because, of course, it's from the era. But I do have to say, right, they did a phenomenal job recreating the sort of effects from the movie with all the beams shooting out from Broly, right? And the, like, key effects on him look great. And I think that the way that they have these assets move as well looks so nice, right? The way that he kind of, you know, shifts back and forth just like he does in the original film. I was always so impressed with this section because even back then they were able to emulate this really well. And I think it's a great recreation, even though there isn't all these crazy lighting effects, because I have a feeling that at the time they probably didn't know how to maybe do them as heavily. Like, they probably had some idea, because obviously later on, you know, we see Broly launch these crazy ki blasts and they look pretty good, but this would be covering the whole screen, and I feel like maybe they just didn't have exactly what it was to, like, completely recreate all of this, because you can see, like, some of it is certainly there, but there is a lot more green on the screen, right, for the movie version. But the ball they still do very well, which is really cool to see. I think they do a very good job of emulating that for sure. I love these little blasts that fly off, because obviously, you know, not only is it just accurate to the movie, but of course, you know, this makes sense in the context of the super attack, because all the little beams fly down. And of course, in the Broly movie version, you know, it is a lot more of these, like, crazy explosions that Goku's dodging, and in the Dokkan version, the sprite just kind of gets hit by them. But, like, even the attention to detail on the explosions is super cool, because you can see, right, as they hit the ground, they are very accurate in terms of the style to the original movie, which I think is a very nice touch, right? I honestly have not really looked at this side by side in a long time, or if I even have, I don't remember, to be honest with you. So this type of stuff is really impressive for the time, and it's cool to see that they were even, you know, always trying to keep as faithful to the source material despite the, you know, less powerful technology that they had. And I think that that is a really cool thing about this super attack, because this move is so simplistic and it doesn't have a lot of close-up shots besides obviously where Broly's face kind of flies by the camera, right? This, by the way, is so impressive. I'm always impressed by Dokkan's backgrounds and explosion effects and stuff like that in the modern day, but I think this one was super ahead of its time, because look at this, bro. They even nailed the little flares there, and even this section looks so good. Like the little explosions and the way that they are, and the way that they're kind of like balanced on the mountains, right? And obviously this is such a good representation of an AoE super attack as well. And obviously they're not going to do this specific angle here because of course they can just kind of have it explode and make it work. But man, a very, very good job, a very good job. Wow. A very job well done. A very good job. There we go. My brain said, ooh, Kakaroto for a moment there. But yeah, I think they do a fantastic job for this, right? Like, this one really close-up shot with Broly, I think they absolutely nail it. And because of, the era of animation that they have and how far away this is, I think it was a lot easier for them to kind of make this one and put it together and still have it look great and look just like the movie. I think this one holds up pretty well, to be honest. It's still definitely a little bit aged, and you can see that for sure. But by golly, I think it's pretty cool. Now, this animation, I will say, their transformation animations are absolutely the most aged thing about them, for sure. Like, I don't think that there's any doubt about that whatsoever, right? However, the one thing that I think is really, really cool about this is obviously, even though this is just a PNG, right, with Broly, having his arms up in the air like this, and then swinging them down, right, to then, be in the power position with the classic Dokkan transformation cut in there. Of course, the purple in the background, as of course Giada's comparing it to, is a comparison, is a reference to the like purple dimension that they go into, right? Obviously, when they're fighting so powerful, that they basically crack through dimensions. And this is a really neat little reference to this scene where obviously, they break through the dimensions. So of course the animation is nothing crazy. It's basically just a fade transition slideshow. But I do like that they included this little reference in there nonetheless. And what's really cool is they actually do nail this, because obviously when Broly transforms, right, they have this super cool sequence of, this like hand-drawn sort of line art, I guess you would call it. Again, not an animator, so I don't know my technical terms. I apologize. But with this sort of style, right, which is so cool, you can see that they even emulate that in the Dokkan version, even though they just kind of covered the PNG with another one. It's still very cool and a fantastic reference to that original source material, right? Yeah, Broly glow green. That's a bit of a tongue twister. And then obviously, as he transforms, right, into the final form, they actually have the background crack, right? Which is super cool. And again, it's literally just, it's obviously the same pose as this, but it's just a different PNG that's now on the screen, which granted, it is cool that they mask it, by having like the light sort of take over the screen. I think that that's definitely a good way to do it, and having just kind of bam right onto the screen. But of course, right, the background itself, I don't know if he's going to show the clip here, but the background itself, when it breaks apart, right, like this, is a reference to in the Broly movie, when obviously, they come back to the normal dimension that they're in. When they come back to Earth, the like purple dimension literally just like shatters behind them, right? So it's really cool that they packed in that little reference there with Broly's super attack. I quite like that a lot. Okay, so now we get into the beefy stuff. We're getting into Broly's transform super attack. This one is really, really cool. So obviously our starting shot here is Broly flying forward here like this. I always thought that this asset looks super cool. And even though this is literally just a PNG, that's basically just kind of like pulsing back and forth, I think that this type of pulsing that they do for flying animations looks pretty good. And they still do this sometimes today. If this animation was remade today, I think Broly's hair would definitely be fluttering in the wind a lot more, and probably Ba's ear would be also fluttering in the wind a lot more than, just this like static PNG. However, I do quite like the lighting effects around Broly. I think they absolutely nailed that look of him being enveloped by that ki. Like, this movie with Broly does that a lot, where they really emphasize the colors and the like auras around the characters that are like not just around their bodies, but then around them, like the bigger aura, rather than just like it being tight knit around them. Which I think a lot of other Dragon Ball media just kind of has like, oh wow, it's just a funny yellow glow that's around them. But they really emphasize it in the Broly movie. So it's cool to see them sort of get that stylistic choice down in this. And this, I was always super impressed by, especially back then. I could not believe how much they nailed this, right? So you basically have Broly fly towards the screen here, right? Which, to be fair, this transition is actually, it's not bad, because it's just his face zoomed in, essentially. So I think that's a good way to mask this like change in the PNG. Because even though they do obviously change to a very drastically different asset, it's still kind of the same facial expression, and it masks then what's going on around it, because obviously it's so close to the screen you don't see what's on the other side. And of course this is a reference to BROLY doing the funny scream like this, which looks really, really good. And I really like that they sort of nail the rocking back and forth sort of whole thing with this, right? Even though obviously in this scene BROLY isn't moving his hands like this, right? Like they kind of have his hands cover his face here. I think this is a pretty cool perspective, right? For sure. And obviously then they can kind of use the hands to sort of distract you from, you know, changing the asset, which ironically enough, I think, yeah, no, they kind of use them well for that. Obviously his face goes from this like gritted teeth face here to then when he moves his hands aside, right, you have this very, very nice looking, you know, stretched out screaming face. And then, you know, they transition into this little bit lower quality asset, but that's of course because they pull back immediately and have BROLY kind of shifting back and forth, which is very simplistic, but it definitely works for the time, right? Very cool, even though you can definitely tell that the movement isn't super fluid, right? Like I think if this was a more modern animation, it wouldn't just be the PNG being rocked back and forth. They would be animating it a little bit closer to how BROLY's expression and his like head actually kind of shakes the whole time, right? But for the time, I think it was done well. And I really, really like what follows, which of course is not only this very, very nice impact frame here, but you have the light explode around BROLY, and I was always really impressed with this because even though the asset does look kind of low quality, the lighting effect on this is fantastic. They absolutely nail the lighting of how this beam would be if it was shooting across the sky. And the background also looks really cool too, because obviously they're not animating the regular background, but they just have this kind of like anime sort of, you know, crazy motion lines background. And it's pretty accurate to the original, you know, even though BROLY's obviously going a lot more crazy in the, you know, animation here, right? He's kind of whipping his head around back and forth. They do that towards the end of the animation, but I do have to note too, even these impact frames here, right? You saw those right when BROLY lifted his head up. Even those impact frames are exactly the same, which is such a nice attention to detail. And they actually did that with Piccolo recently too. So super cool to see that. But obviously BROLY's head just kind of rocks back and forth for this beginning section, where in the actual animation it's a lot more like crazed. But then you can see they do actually do that for the end, right? When BROLY, you know, brings his head down to then fire the beam towards the camera. So I think that was Dokkan maybe ad-libbing a little bit, which I think works for obviously making this animation a little bit more fluid, because obviously then you can see, right, he brings the beam down and you can actually see his face facing towards the camera for a moment before blasting, right? And then obviously the whole screen is covered by the green light. And that is a fantastic way to transition into this. I will say, it is a bit of a shame because of how old this unit is. Oh, they even got the background. Look at that. Just like how the movie is. This little, like, you know, the way that the beam sort of wiggles once he finally launches it, we definitely don't get that in this animation. And some of the, you know, like in-between stuff where you can kind of see BROLY flashing in the beam. Maybe that is what they were kind of trying to reference with BROLY sort of being there with this. But nonetheless, I think if that was like modernized, they definitely would have like gotten that little in-between section good. But obviously they had to cut some stuff for this. And at the time, I don't know if they had the technological knowledge or prowess to be able to animate that. Maybe, but, you know, either they omitted it or they just, you know, didn't have the, you know, tech at the time where they weren't as skilled, you know, whatever the case may be. But then, of course, we have BROLY blasting, right, which is a very, very nice shot. Very accurate to the movie. Obviously, the explosion effect is a little bit different. And this is basically just a PNG of BROLY here for the beginning section, right, where he's just kind of standing there, which, to be fair, it basically is in the movie. They do have a very, very noticeable, though, like, switch in positions here with the PNGs. But obviously, you know, this being an older animation, that is kind of to be expected. But we do have BROLY firing forward, which I always thought this was cool that, you know, they have him kind of slide back as he's firing the blast towards he's basically off camera, right? I think that that was always pretty cool. And a good transition to then the close-up, right? Because obviously now you have BROLY firing the beam. And I always thought that this looked incredibly well for the time. Obviously this beam is very simple, but BROLY himself looks very, very nice. having him, basically just standing there stanced up until, you have this far away shot here and Broly leans his hand up. So they kind of combine these two shots a little bit, right? You unfortunately don't get this shot from the Broly movie, which is really, really cool, right? This shot where Broly is standing up like this, shooting the mouth beam forward, and you're kind of like at his feet looking at it. I feel like if this was modernized as well, I think this is another animation that may be included in here. But obviously, I feel like this is another thing that may have been really hard for them to do at this time, because they are definitely a lot better about like angles nowadays, right? With the way that they're sort of like having the characters posed within the animation. I think that they definitely have a little bit more uniqueness to it today, and they have a lot better idea of how to sort of accomplish those things, but I don't know if an angle like this would have been possible back then necessarily, or maybe they just didn't know how to animate it. However, they obviously sort of transition it then into this section with Broly, right, where he is launching the beam forward, and super crazy attention to detail here again as well. You can see that these little balls that he has in his hand, right, they kind of create the ki blast, are obviously there, and then they spread apart. And even though not exactly like the style of the movie, still a very good representation of it, I feel like. And it's a nice amalgamation, because obviously this isn't exactly how this scene is playing out, but it's cool that obviously they're kind of using this super attack in their own way. And I gotta say, this is pretty impressive for the time. Go back to like right here, this camera angle where they sort of pan it around a little bit, right? That's pretty good for back then, I would say. That's pretty cool. I see a lot of modern animations do that, so that's really cool to see that in something this old, right? Then obviously you have the beams basically just go and clash with the enemy. Obviously, in this scene, Gogeta's just kind of dodging them, right? So for this scene, I think this is probably a little bit ad-libbed, but I think that this looks good, with basically just the explosion effect, and, it's kind of implied that the enemy is in there. Obviously, then they sort of get flown away, right? I think that this section works for, obviously, what they're trying to do here. And I like this a lot, actually, with, like, obviously the smoke being there, and then, bam, the enemy sort of breaks out through the smoke. I think that that's a pretty neat little transition into the next scene, which, of course, we then get the card art for Broly. And of course, it follows up with this. And I gotta say, for the time, this shot is really impressive. This is also the thumbnail of this video. You have Broly charging up the attack. Again, I don't think that they could have accomplished this back then, right? Like with how crazy the almost like psychedelic looking effects. They try and kind of emulated the Dokkan one. Like it's sort of there, but it's definitely not like exactly how this looks. This almost looks like 3D, like the 3D glasses type of thing, kind of is almost the feeling that this gets me. But even though they couldn't get it exact, I think again for the time, it looks fantastic. And I like these lighting effects as they sort of come into the beam. Again, very reminiscent of the movie as well. And you have the camera pull back to Broly's arm there, which of course, again, very, very good representation of the movie. Obviously, Broly is gritting his teeth and screaming here, but like, whatever. And then the transition to this where Broly is sort of holding this behind him. I love this shot from the Dokkan essay, by the way. It's so good. Can I also talk about the ki? Oh my gosh. I was talking about before how with this movie they really emphasize a lot of the ki effects, and I think with the essay they do a great job of referencing that. And that is something that I kind of find a little bit endearing about these older essays, right? Because obviously you can see Broly does get that here eventually a little bit, but in this like first part he obviously kind of doesn't have it, or at least it's not in the frame, which I suppose is like kind of accurate, because then once they get back to here, right, he does sort of have that aura around him, right? Like this is basically a good shot. And again, even though it isn't exactly the same, right, because I think as well they probably weren't as good about these fisheye angles, because I think I've seen a couple of these in modern animations. Funny enough, I think maybe STR Gogeta actually has an angle like this, ironically enough, the Super Saiyan Blue one, right? So of course they can't have this exactly, but I think this is a great like ad-libbed version of this. And I think that that's something that I really find endearing about these old animations, is that not only do they reference the original source material as best as they can, but they're also a good like overall representation of a character from a movie and the scenes that they take place in, rather than with the modern ones where they are an exact representation of the scene rather than almost like a full representation of the character. I know that's kind of a weird comparison to make, but that's kind of just the way that I feel. And I don't think either one is bad. I like both of them a lot. It is just a little bit nostalgic, obviously, looking back at some of these. I definitely love the way that the modern animations look when they're good, obviously. But it is cool to see stuff like this from back then, too. So, again, even though obviously this is pretty, like, fluid on the, you know, actual movie version of this, and on the Dokkan version, it is pretty, like, changing between poses, right? This one is really obvious because obviously it goes from so dark to so light, and BROLY is almost at, like, a completely different angle. You're, you know, looking at him kind of twisting around the screen. And it goes from this zoom in to then, of course, really zoomed in on his face with him screaming, and the PNG just sort of sliding across the screen, moving towards BROLY's hand, to then see the ki blast then fire forward. And the angles as well definitely aren't exactly how they are in the movie, because obviously it's a lot more dramatic in the movie than it is in the Dokkan version. However, I still think that, again, the Dokkan version is a very good representation of this scene overall. And I think as well, again, like, I know I keep saying it, I'm sorry, but it's so good. The lighting effects on these are fantastic throughout this entire section, even though clearly this would be a lot more fluid if it was modernized, right? Especially like this to this, right? Like, that's a pretty big jump. These lighting effects that outline BROLY and the lighting here, because you can clearly see that obviously the light is emanating from this side of the screen, right? And BROLY then bringing it forward, right? Obviously the ki blast looks great. The little, like, edges of the energy blast are just so nicely animated with these little wiggles, right? I think those are super well done. Obviously, then you have BROLY bring his hand forward, and the ki even looks really dynamic here, even though it basically just is a transition from him screaming to then him holding it forward, which, interestingly enough, this scene does kind of jump to this shot, and they kind of cut out a little bit of the middle stuff. But even this, right, and this, like, impact frame, right, you can see once BROLY fires it, which, by the way, this lighting looks fantastic, and the beam actually emanating out of his hand looks fantastic, right? Even these different lighting effects that come off of the beam are so impressive and so well done, frankly. You can see on the movie version, right, all that stuff is completely accurate, right? Which is really cool, right? Like, even this kind of exploding out into a brighter light is even accurate to the movie. And obviously, you know, once it kind of pans back a little bit with the camera, right, even that is exactly how it is in the movie, right? Obviously, the angle is maybe not exactly the same, and of course, maybe BROLY's hair would be fluttering, and the, you know, cloak would be kind of fluttering in the wind. But it looks so good, right? Especially for the time that it came out. And you have this beam sort of fly towards the enemy like this, which again is exactly how it looks in the movie, right? This angle that they have it kind of fly past the camera and then fly forward a little bit, right, until it makes contact with the enemy, right? And then obviously for the Dokkan version, you know, they have it actually, like, blast through the enemy, because of course this is the iconic scene where Gogeta dodges right past the blast and then goes to attack BROLY. But with the Dokkan Battle 1, right, they obviously have the little bit of the beam kind of collide with the earth. And funny enough, even though this is sort of Gogeta doing this attack, they kind of reference this and use that for the BROLY one a little bit. It's definitely a little bit different for sure, but that's kind of funny that they almost transformed this scene into BROLY's scene. But with the end here, right, obviously this section, because of course it doesn't actually make contact with the enemy because Gogeta dodges it, they kind of ad-lib this section a little bit, and I think this looks fantastic with this little glint of light, and obviously the reflection of the light on the ground. I think that looks really, really nice the way that they handled it. And then, of course, the explosion outward, right? Look at these amazing effects. Let's actually go back to the regular video for this one. These amazing effects right here where they sort of explode outward. Oh my gosh, these look so good. And not to mention the ground, you know, cracking rapidly under the force of this explosion, right? They kind of mask it with these impact frames, but I think that that's a great way to sort of bring this in and have it rapidly be on the screen without even having to animate it too much. And even they do a good job animating it with, like, the, you know, lava really feel like, you know, it's kind of coming through the earth, right? They definitely do a very, very good job of that for sure. And the final resulting explosion looks fantastic as well. Again, I just wanted to note the last thing was, you know, it's a little bit not lined up here because, again, his older ones aren't always as exact on the frames, basically. But with even the beam here, right, you can see that the Dokkan one, you know, it kind of fires off to the side, a good transition between the angles too, and it literally follows suit with the movie one, right, because then it just crashes into what would be Gogeta in the Dokkan one. So yeah, that is Broly's animations. These older animations are always so much fun to kind of take a look back and see how they were. To be honest, I'm very impressed with these. I definitely think that there is a lot of stuff that could obviously be, you know, updated for modern animations for sure, especially the transformation animation, but all the neat little references within these, and especially the 18 key for this guy is super impressive for the time. Even with it, there's certainly stuff that they could update, but I think for, you know, being some of the first really, you know, high quality modern animations, these guys go above and beyond for what they did for the time. I remember when these guys when these guys came out, rather, excuse me, everybody and their mother, including myself, was just so impressed with how these looked. Like, they just looked so good. I would definitely love to see these updated for sure, and it would also be interesting to kind of see a direct comparison between these and a potential updated version of these. That would be a cool video series to do, to look at like attacks in Dokkan that got a direct upgrade from another unit. I'd have to think of some examples for that, but that would definitely be cool. But let me know what you think of this guy's animations in the comment section below. Definitely let me know if you are excited for this EZA as well. I know I most certainly am, because obviously we've been waiting so long for these guys to EZA. Broly, your animations are good, brother. You passed. Go, Broly, go, go. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Thank you so much for watching. Dokkan Assets out. Peace.